Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this FS Club webinar. The Real Deal: Is Your Leadership Team Truly Capable? Presented by Nick Mayhew. My name is Ian Aitchison, a man born into leadership by accident at birth, and for whom the leadership role has been a learning experience for over half a century, and the perennial task to ensure that one's leadership team is indeed truly capable. It's my honor and pleasure to chair today. I can only do so, though, thanks to the generosity of our sponsors, who allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. But before we get out of the way as quickly as possible and hand over to Nick, some housekeeping notes. The slides are available to download and chat from the webinar website. They'll be holding a 20-minute Q&A session after Nick's presentation. I'd encourage you to use the chat function, question function on GoToWebinar to send your questions to me so I can engage Nick in a conversation. And so to our speaker, Nick Mayhew, MD of Alembic Strategy. Alembic's lived approach is to bring the QI and neuroscience of leading together for its leadership clients so they find the balance to resolve the great tensions they face as we go forward. So without further ado, Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ian. Can we have the next slide, please, Peter? Thank you. Thank you very much for being here for this webinar. I want to make it as interactive as possible. So I know that there is a questions area and we've got time towards the end of the session for questions. Ian is going to jump on that and keep an eye on it. I've said I'm quite happy to take questions as we go through, and so I'll leave that to him as to whether he picks them up or not. But just find that questions area to start with, and just feel free to use it almost like a discussion board. I'm sure that what I'm going to say today won't land with everybody. It'll land with some people. You may agree with me, you may disagree with me. It doesn't matter. That's a great conversation for us to have. So just feel free to pile in and let's get the conversation going. So a bit of an agenda here. I'm going to introduce myself properly to you all in a second, talk a bit about what the real deal might mean, and then we thought we'd have a quick poll on it to see what you're feeling about that. Then I'm going to discuss sort of various different dimensions of leadership, what I feel from our experience makes a great CEO, and the leadership team around that. We're going to talk a bit about motivation, and then wrap up discussing what I feel is really a fundamental skill, which is competent conflict management in leadership teams. And we're going to wrap up with a poll around change, and then take as many questions as you care to throw at me. Next slide, please. So a bit about us, Alembic Strategy. I just want to slightly correct Ian. It's Chi Neuroscience. So my background, I trained after a history degree at Oxford as a chartered accountant, and was for most of my career a senior partner, main board member, responsible for transformation and change services and internally at a mid-sized firm, and created Alembic in 2016 to do what my wife and I had always wanted to do, which was to take our experience into a people domain as opposed to a finance domain. And we've been doing that with great pleasure since then. And it is built on our skill set. I was brought up by a psychotherapist, and we were also Buddhists as a family. So my particular experience of that was playing rugby at Monmouth Comp on a Monday afternoon, and then going straight into a Tai Chi class, which I didn't really want to do after a couple of hours on the rugby pitch. But I found the experience of energy shift in doing the Tai Chi class really interesting at a very young age. And having meditated since I was little, also knew that moving my body made a difference to how I was feeling. And we've built our leadership practice really around the body work, taking into account the fact that leadership is an extraordinarily high pressure position, and it has an impact on your biophysiology. And knowing that and stepping up into that is one of the key things that people need to learn in order to be really, really competent as leaders. So we'll touch on that a little bit as we go through. So we're a boutique advisory. We specialize in this embodied change for leadership teams, and we work with family businesses, which is where we sort of cut our teeth, so 20 million up to a few hundred million, so relatively small businesses. We work for private equity investors, and we help their investees, and we cut our teeth turning around leadership teams. But these days we do pre-deal assessment of leadership teams, which is really interesting. And then help them scale up and grow. Next slide, please, Peter. Oh yeah, so real deal. What on earth does that mean? We thought we'd just do a poll on this to start with. Peter, do you want to just launch the poll? And while he's doing that, I guess you may think that this is a bit of a strange question, but I'm wondering whether you think you are the real deal. Whether you know what that really means. Sometimes people ask us that, and I'm going to go and talk about that in a second. But what does it mean? Is it like saying someone is soulful, something that you kind of know but can't explain? Have you been led by someone who you thought was the real deal? Do you really know what it takes to be the real deal?
Thanks, Nick. It looks like polls are coming in. We're getting towards 80% completed now, so a couple more seconds, I think, and then we'll close the deal. There we go. So 72% unsure and 17% think yes.
Thank you. Okay, so just interesting. So so most of you are unsure, so hopefully this will be a little bit helpful, and I'll give you my sort of thoughts on it. So as I said, we spend most of our time working with leadership teams, and in particular, we've spent quite a lot of time in the last few years helping private equity investors at the point of investment, assessing their leadership teams before the money goes in. And this question, I put it up on the slides because it's a question we're pretty often asked by them. Is the CEO the real deal? Is this leadership team the real deal? It's kind of a strange question in reality. And I guess you can understand it because at the point of investment, they've got maximum anxiety. They've done their analysis. They've normally done some form of chemistry test. These days, private equity firms are getting a bit better at digging a little deeper into the competency, chemistry, and traits of their leadership teams, but still it's poorly done. And so although they kind of have a good feel for the business and the opportunity, they don't know about the leadership team very, very well. And they have lots of problems. Post-investment, businesses will frequently underperform because someone who looked great in one context can suddenly look very vulnerable in a new one, which is interesting. And when they are underperforming, it's having an impact on them achieving that single point of truth, which is a successful exit in a defined timescale, more commonly than not. And if they don't achieve that, it has a huge impact on their reputation as investment directors. And so they're really anxious about whether they can hit that single point of truth. And when it's not going well, they really struggle to try and tackle it. And they need to tackle it through change at leadership level, because they're not going to get directly involved. They may or may not have the leverage to do that, whether they're a majority or minority shareholder. They may or may not want to use what leverage they've got to make a big change because it's so sensitive and it's so critical, and they're not on the inside of that. And so getting it right at the outset is really critical. And what we find in reality, in fact, through hundreds of clients, is just variability. Every leader I've met and every context I've met is a little different. But there are some sort of common factors that you can look out for. So I'm going to give you my ones and just interested to see how you respond to those. Next slide, please, Peter. So one of the big things I look out for is this ability to resolve the biggest tensions. Now, some of the people out there talking about leadership talk about them as polarities. And I kind of get that because it gives you that sense of, a great decision between one direction or another direction. It gives that sense of the importance of it. But in reality, I prefer tensions. Tensions is something we talk about all the time around the leadership table. Tensions that are naturally occurring within the business. It's set up to experience these tensions. It's often not binary, like a polarity. It's often really nuanced. You can be pulled in 3 or 4 different directions, and maybe there's a creative solution you're searching for that balances these lines of tension up in the business. but great leaders just have this knack of resolving the biggest tensions with a sense of balance. So I've posted some ideas about what they might be up here, and you probably recognize them. You've probably got your own list. It's not a comprehensive list. So, between now and the future, how do we decide between something that's needed right now and time and energy put into the future? Urgency, the customer service calls, the issues that we've got on deliveries, the sort of on time in full that's happening right now, and things that are maybe not that urgent but are fundamentally important, like building new channels, building new relationships, building new products, building new businesses. Profit and growth is a classic one, so people often say sales is vanity, profit is sanity, but a business that's not growing will have a lower valuation. A business that's successful should be growing, it should be attractive. Certainly you wouldn't say we should have a declining business. So growth is really fundamental as well. And how do you balance between profit and growth and manage to achieve both? Cost and values, I think, is really interesting. So when you've got big cost decisions, how do you balance that against the values you hold as a company and as a team, and sort of find the right line there? Privacy and transparency, this is huge these days. People really pushing for greater transparency, greater authenticity, but fundamentally privacy is really important in business. Trade secrets and confidential decisions that are kept behind closed doors until it can be told. It's a very important part of running a business. So there's a tension always between open communication and closedness. Unyielding and open. So I like these as kind of first slightly emotional ones. So the ability to say no and to hold your ground, the ability to hold fast and be unyielding, let's say in a major negotiation, as opposed to openness, open-mindedness, flexibility, adaptability. Both are really important, but when do you do them? Again, great tension between operations, between strategic change, between threats, between opportunities, and then finally one that we see a lot between ego, which might sometimes leak into aggression and anger, and maybe teamwork, which you might characterize as collaborative, and the ability to work together towards consensus. So how do you find the balance in those things as well? So good leaders just have this natural knack to resolve those big tensions in a balanced way, and not to lose too much sleep over it, because these are the things that will keep you awake at night and you will remember for the rest of your life, certainly from my experience. And my comment here is that great leaders have a point of difference, which is the way that they then additionally engage people in a purposeful story that makes sense. So that knack of bringing you in so that you feel like you're a character in the play, that you have a part to play. And it's so helpful if you feel like you're a participant in the greater story, because then when these tensions resolve in a way that's not great for you, it helps you cope, and it helps you stay, and it helps people stay loyal through those decisions which go against them. And I think great leaders just have a knack for doing that. We'll talk about why in a sec. Next slide, please, Peter. Okay, so this is a big, complicated slide, but I quite like it. It isn't trying to cover 100% of things. So let me just walk you through this idea of the dimensions. So first of all, you've got these big concentric circles in the middle. So think of those as like ripples in a pond, and the ripples here are decisions. So really what you want in an organization is decisions to be made at the right point, at the point where they should be made in a capable way. So ultimately that should be by an individual, just making a decision day by day. And if they can't resolve that on their own, it goes up, normally gets resolved at a team level. If the team can't resolve it, it will go up again, and then it'll get resolved, at company or department level, depending on the size of the organization. So let's say it's company by company in a group. If the individual companies can't resolve it and it's a big strategic issue, it'll go up and it'll get resolved at group level. Ultimately, what should happen is, if the organization is efficient and the processes are lined up really well with great customer service, most of the waste that creates tension should be absent, but that's not always the case, as you'll know. But let's say it is, really then you're just talking about the decisions that can't be resolved at a lower level because the tensions are resolvable at that highest level. Everything else should sum out, and what should end up at that outer level with the chief executive and the leadership team is the most significant decisions of the company. That's what should go in their diaries. And I've used diaries on purpose here because it's about the availability of their of their mental resources and their psychological resources to play into those questions is what you're looking for. They don't want to be distracted by things which they shouldn't be. They want to be focused on the things which are of most gravity and resolving them. And so really it's about managing their diary by summing everything out and delegating down. So then I kind of posed the question about how you do that. And a classic way of doing it is with different positions. And obviously there are more positions around the board table. I ignored the chairman, for example, maybe the CTO, chief investment officer, marketing director, HR director, etc. So there's many, many other positions, but just looking at these sort of three legs of the sort of the main stool to start with. A classic way to resolve this is to create portfolios which match sort of innate traits of a key position, and to make that person with those traits accountable for that end of the line, if you like. So if you think about this as a relational line, where, for example, the COO is pulling for now and the CEO is pulling for the future, you know, there's the tension on that line. And then you just add the CFO in, and he or she is thinking about the money. So we've got three lines in tension, and we're trying to pull, and each person is accountable for each of those tensions. You bring them together and you're looking for creativity in that relationship. You're looking for creative solutions from people who are willing to hold accountability for those traits. And that is, you know, the fertile grounds for building a powerful and capable leadership team around those three big sort of chairs, if you like. So let's have a quick look at each of them. You've got the CEO there, and this isn't always the case. People come with their different traits. They're not, you know, being CEO is not the whole of them. Normally is a pragmatic solution that we find which balances these things out in a very specific way, but just in generalizing at the moment. So the CEO has that external focus. They're at the highest level of issues. Ultimately, they're completely accountable for the lot. They're looking outward. They're thinking about market, about strategy, about best practice. You'd hope that they were a brilliant communicator, but fundamentally they've got to communicate about all of that. They have to develop or create that vision. Hopefully they don't do that in silence in their own mind. They involve people in that. They're thinking about customer service from the point of view of the future. So this is the big, where are we going question. Tend to be, not always, tend to be big picture, not great at detail, tend to be charismatic, not always, but tend to be. Often really intuitive, very experienced if they're good public speaker, solid public speaker, you know, and they hold that vision. All right, and then by contrast, you've got the COO there. So this is just the first step in big partnership at the top of the organization. Again, at the highest level of issues, but looking inwards. So their focus should be around people, around systems, around change, process improvement, performance management. Their job is more around mission and purpose than vision and future. Customer service is orientated around how are we doing right now? How are we doing today? And you need someone here who has the ability to problem solve, to be a flexible thinker, to be a people person, to be a project leader, to be a performance manager. Now, where you get COOs, sometimes they're not quite at the right level, and they end up being process managers or, you know, tinkering around some of the sort of projects. What you want is someone really at a higher level. So I would say if you want the CEO to be sort of really big picture, you know, sometimes they can be so stellar that they leave everybody behind with their vision. The COO is that translator. You know, they're the person that I would say they're mid-chunk. You know, they're not fine detail necessarily, or they can do detail really well. They're mid-chunk, so they can translate that big picture vision into reality. And they don't want to get too stuck into it because they don't want to get their time lost in operations. So they need to stay at the right level. So therefore, it's about structuring, delegating, making sure things are getting done. And then finally, you've got the CFO. You know, here what you want is that neutral focus. So someone within the team who holds more distance and more perspective against the natural passions and tunnel vision of the other two roles. So typically a CEO and your COO will have tunnel vision in different directions, and your CFO just wants to be less emotional or more threat orientated in their emotions, which will make them more independent. They'll want to be that voice of truth. They're going to look for data to support decisions. They're definitely going to be focused around managing risk and threat. And they tend to focus on systems compliance, regulation, and they have a detail orientation. Not always. They tend to be introverted. Again, not always. who tend to be risk averse and more considered. Now, if you've got those three positions, as I say, holding accountability for the role, and also to a degree, with the right traits to hold that role, then the question you're going to ask yourself is, okay, how do these three and other roles work? So what is the chemistry? And fundamentally, bringing these into creativity is about providing the right chemistry between the characters. Next slide, please. Hopefully that's a helpful kind of overview. So here I've just kind of started to touch on, my favorites. I'm sure you'll have different views on this, but just from my experience of helping leaders transform and hiring leaders for clients. So fundamentally, we've got the top two. I've split the list in two, as you can see. I've got the first two and then 3 to 10. I've kind of italicized some just to give you a sort of sense of where my mind goes on this when I'm looking. The basics, right? The hygiene factor, 1 and 2. They really need to have that deep sectoral experience in the business that they're coming into to lead. Just gets them over the line to have that really. And you're looking for the person that's got real depth and breadth, knows everybody, knows all the products, knows the market, knows the competitors, and is really thinking about that and deeply involved in that. They also need, ideally, to have leadership and operational experience beyond the current scale. Now that draws in a challenge. So why would they join a smaller business? And again, that might be because it's growing. It's going somewhere. They see it as having potential. So there has to be something exciting about the business opportunity that really grabs them. And you're kind of looking for that enthusiasm at the point of hiring and looking for the reason why, because this is fundamental to their motivation for being here, what they want to do with this. And I'll touch a little bit more on the wider motivations in a sec. But fundamentally, 1 and 2 give you that person that knows where to find the angles for the competitive advantage and can therefore broadly set the strategic direction. Okay, and then we get into the personal traits, so 3 to 10. So motivation and energy, I've already touched on that a little bit. They're absolutely fundamental. I've put the word catchy in front, which I like. You probably know what I mean by that, but it's finding that balance. There's nothing wrong with aggression. We'll talk about managing it in a minute, but you want them to have that balance between being forceful and being engaging. And there's something about some leaders who have that innately in them, which is catchy, it's exciting. It makes you want to follow, makes you interested, it makes you feel inspired, but also feel a sense of wanting to serve them, wanting to look after them, wanting to do your best for them. And some people just have that in them, and it can be developed, but it's kind of catchiness, I think, which means that it's everyone else picks up on the flames and follows along. Typically, they're very intuitive, but herein lies a problem. You'll know some leaders who are so intuitive that their leaps of imagination leave everyone in the dust, and everyone else is left confused, wondering what on earth that meant. And so you fundamentally need 5, which may not come from the chief executive themselves. It could come from team members, but ultimately they need to be able to tell that tale emotionally, analytically, and most importantly, clearly, so that people can get what they have to do about it. And that often is missing. So people will have that intuitive big picture nature, but not necessarily have the ability to explain where it's come from and what it means. 6 for me is one of the most important ones. The tensions of high-level leadership are tough, and they will definitely pull you in all sorts of directions and test your resilience to the nth degree. And so understanding your inner landscape, understanding where you are emotional, understanding your own story and how you've become who you are, understanding what are your high value items, and what are your must-haves, and how to manage your own energy between having distance and perspective and stepping into passion and forcefulness, but not being lost in those differences, that great inner polarity between neutral and passionate. So people who can lead themselves and know themselves well and understand their inner environment are pretty good at this. You kind of want them to be adept in the end at shared decision making, because businesses are complex and there's lots of facts all over the place. No one can hope to know all of that. And so in the end, it's about bringing all that data together. We'll talk about that again in a sec. Obviously, bags of emotional and social intelligence. And for me, a really big one is empathic. I've worked with leaders who are and who aren't. I think the big point of difference about leaders who are empathic is that somehow they have this amazing ability to make you feel that they care about you. And that's such a help when some of the decisions you have to make don't go for you and are tough on you. It gets you through those tough times when the pressures are really too much. And so empathy, I think, is a really important quality, and not everyone has it. And then finally, just flexibility, and it goes with that ability to lead yourself. So also we're looking for people who are just realistic, able to be adaptable and cope well with failure. In fact, look hungry for failure. People talk about fail fast, which is a cliche, but in reality in life, the way we learn is by making mistakes, and business is no different from anywhere else. It's not really about that. It's about high pressure situations. That last point in the Wimbledon final is a high pressure point and just feels very, very different from the practice points that you played earlier in the week. And it's the ability to deal with the high pressure points without losing it that really makes people stand out. In the end, without pressure, it's just the same process of hitting a ball over a net and keeping it in the court. So next slide, please.
Just at this point, Nick, as we get the high pressure point of timing, we'll just remind people to put in their questions as we approach the question and answer.
Really happy to take questions on any of this. Okay, so just moving on a little bit into leadership teams and teamwork. So you're looking for people who have got strengths in each other's blind spots. So that diversity of traits and abilities is really important. And the ability to actually talk about that and to explicitly be in each other's blind spots, deliberately and intentionally be in each other's blind spots. So no emotion being held about that, just openness about that. High but different motivations, otherwise you get really odd organizations which kind of spin off in very strange directions. So a variety of different motivations, which we'll chat about in a sec. And then I've just talked about great conflict management in high stakes situations. So how do we resolve our tensions to get through that? I've seen so many businesses last year when COVID hit, go in on themselves, go into a closed room and be unable to come out with the right solutions at the start of COVID last year. It really tested management teams everywhere and conflict management to try and come up with collective answers. Some people did it well, some people really suffered as leadership teams during that process. So it's very, very important. Next slide, please. Okay, so motivation. One of the things that we do as opposed to psychometric testing is look at motivation and look at motivational differences, and it works really well because it's a little different. There's no right or wrong answer. Motivation is poorly understood but fundamental to success, because rather than traits, motivation is that drive that makes it happen. And it comes from two of the most ancient organs that sit within the brain, called the thalamus and hypothalamus, which all mammals and other creatures also have. These are the source of drive in our lives. Maybe the difference between AI and a computer is the thalamus and hypothalamus, because those two organs are what make you wake up in the morning and say, I think we'd have a great day at the beach today, let's do it, which AI perhaps hasn't quite got yet, and push us forward in life. So they are fundamental to thirst, to hunger, to the need for company, for sex, for family, relationship. They're the things that drive us for all of those things, for our sense of self and our sense of safety. Once you get past those basic descriptions, there are many colors and flavors out there. So if you think about food, for example, not all of you are motivated in the same way about food. You all have your own preferences. And so actually, when you get out there, there's a lot more color to find. We have 9 really interesting types of motivation that we find pretty commonly. And they're split into 3 groups. So you've got relationship motivators in green, achievement motivators in red, and growth motivators in blue. Now, you might look at them for a moment and see the descriptions and just think, what really strikes me? What do I think I am? Am I a creator? Am I a builder? Am I a friend? Maybe one or two really stick out for you. And you can think of your colleagues and family and think about what might be different about their motivations just by looking at this list. It helps you kind of paint by numbers and get into their zone a bit more. So the defender, looking for security, predictability, stability. The friend, for belonging, for friendship, for fulfilling relationships. The star, recognition, respect, social esteem. Really important to know that, right? If you're the leader of this person. Director, looking for power and influence, control of people and resources. Important to have on the team. Builder, looking for money and material satisfaction, above average living. They'll drive profitability and drive out waste. Expert, obviously mastery of knowledge. And then you have the creator, seeking innovation, expressing creative potential. You have the spirit, seeking freedom, independence, ability to make their own decisions. And then the searcher, looking for meaning, looking for making a difference, looking for purpose and worthwhile things. These are really powerful motivations, and we find people have peaks in one or two of them. And I will tell you that I've had great chief executives and great leadership team members who have expressed all 9. A few of each of the 9. So there's no one of these that sets a great leader apart. Next slide, please. Okay, I said I was going to talk a little bit about failure again, and just this last slide is really about how to form that high-performing team. So I've just referenced momentarily on the left the book by Matthew Syed, Black Box Thinking, which no doubt some of you will have read. And fundamentally, black box thinking is about high pressure leadership, so cockpit leadership, if you like, and talks about all the failures that led to a particular type of high pressure management in the aircraft industry. And fundamentally, it is akin to what I've been describing. It's people in highly respected roles holding accountability for particular portfolios of information, data, and decision making, working together as a team. So how do you manage the emotion in that team so that there is no bias, there's no groupthink, there's no mistakes in misidentifying the data? How do you have the ability to call out an error in the most high status person in the room? Fundamentally, a great leadership team can do that. They all have emotion. There's no such thing as an unemotional person. And there will always be things that push us out of our window of tolerance and make us become reactive, so we lose it. So how do you get people back into their window of tolerance, and how do you get that conversation back on track? Great teams have the ability to do that, which is about conflict. Fundamentally, it's about conflict, about going through conflict, about learning each other and how you manage that and resolving it and having a method of resolving it so that you get to a quick and easy method of passing difficult information, difficult news between each other, and just listening and hearing it and dealing with it together. That's the trick. Unfortunately, there's no way to do that other than by going through some form of conflict at the lowest level, difficult conversations which are uncomfortable, where you're feeling emotional and you need to express that. At the highest level, full-blown fights, right? And you'll have seen that plenty of times in company environments, full-blown fights. And the trick here is also that every time you change one of the personalities in the team, the chemistry of the team changes, because people just bring themselves, and that changes the balance of all of the lines of tension that we were talking about earlier on. The chemistry just changes. So every time you put someone new in the team, you go back to forming again. Forming is that early phase where people are polite. It doesn't last long because normally the pressures will tell and there'll be a big decision to be made, and that'll bring everybody naturally into these tensions. And you'll go through a struggle over it, an emotional struggle. The emotions will emerge. And it's not until you've gone through that and worked that out that you have kind of orientated your team neurology, and you've worked out the emotional and analytical shape of each other a little bit more, which you only do when you get up on the rocks and you have those pressure moments. That fundamentally pulls your drive into resolving it, understanding it, it not working, being frustrated. That frustration of doing a 1,000-piece puzzle gets you those insights, gets you that intuition, those aha moments, and fundamentally helps you work through it. So you need that pressure and you need that drive, and you fundamentally need the emotion. Emotion is a really important factor, and it's a key part of how we create and lay down all of our memories. memory formation always has an emotional component to it. So really important point to note. Once you've got through that, you get into norming, which is just systemizing it, making performance pervasive. And then we bring in the more positive feelings. So getting up to high performance is again emotional. And fundamentally, it feels great when you're performing at high level together as a team, when you know each other so well that you don't have to do those sort of detailed descriptions when you're making your plays. You know, when you work offline together as much as you work online together. When you are all deeply involved in the story and deeply committed to that single point of truth and just solving problems together day in, day out, it can be great fun. And that's what high performance feels like. There's no way to high performance and creating other than by creating stability to resolve emotional conflict. We've never found another way of doing it other than by going through that. Next slide, please. Okay, so just curious about how everyone is reacting to all of that. So Peter, do you want to launch the poll? Yeah, so this one, I want you to think about whether you're able to make change happen, because ultimately that's what problem solving in leadership teams is about. Now, it could be in your personal life. So have you made pervasive, lasting change in your personal life? Do you want to know how to do that? Maybe lead yourself is an interesting question. Alternatively, have you done it through a system? Have you done it in business with colleagues and processes? Have you made lasting, pervasive change in your organization? Do you know how to do that? Can you do that? And when you think about these things, they're really difficult.
I think we have the results in, and quite clearly this audience, 80% say yes, persuasive change they can, which is great. Conscious of time, Nick, so I think we need to move quickly through towards questions.
There we have the summary. So happy to take any questions. So
if we then, while we've got the summary slide, pull up the questions. First question was from, where have I got the questions just disappeared? Let me just do this. Here we go. How nuanced are leadership skills and the requirements by sector? For example, public versus commercial, or by different sectors, for example, mining versus technology. Question from Bob McDowell.
I would say that there are obvious differences because the structure of the company pulls you in slightly different directions. So more of the difference comes with scale and with geographical spread. It becomes more difficult and different when you're dealing with more remote teams. And certainly, for example, the example of mining, you might have teams out on site who are out in very remote locations. There are obviously different issues to resolve there. But I would say that's more experiential. So someone who is deeply involved in that kind of trade would know that. And the people leadership skills are going to be very similar. Although the nuance is going to be around the differences in environment, the differences in provision you need to make. There'll be different risks obviously involved, and so that's more in the fact pattern of the business, less about how you deal with people.
Great, thank you. And then here's a good question, Graham Elliott. Can a person be a good leader unless they're also a good follower? And is it the essence of leadership entailed in the ability to understand the needs and styles of their followers?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I can't remember who it was that said that leaders are built by followers, but it's obviously right. And unless you've got some followers, you aren't a leader, even if you think you are. My experience of this is that there is actually leadership across the whole of the senior leadership teams. It feels often in our practice like an essence of the team, which ebbs and flows. That responsibility shifts from moment to moment and context to context. Yeah, and great leaders, I guess it's inherent in that ability to move from being the decision maker to being collaborative, that they have that ability to understand that sometimes leadership, their accountability doesn't mean they have to lead on this moment, and that they're happy to follow their team and to empower their team. So I think it's an essential quality. I think the great leadership point is knowing when to step in and make the decision, and knowing when you should just still wait and let others take it on.
No, yes, a very, very good point there, both of you. Now, from Lassie, we have, in my experience, it is often the skills and personality traits that allows a person to rise up through an organization is quite detrimental to actually doing a competent job and becoming a leader. Is this something you have experience with?
Absolutely. So back in the 1970s, I think it was called the Peter Principle, wasn't it? So there are two sides to this. One is someone who is maybe aggressive, narcissistic, and maybe also very much the star, and pushing competitively to beat everybody to get to the top. That's one side of it. Now, there's nothing wrong with competition. It's how it's played out, and of course, people who are like that will come to a limit where that won't be the answer, because in the end they'll need to change and become part of a team. It's always the team at the top in my experience, and in the end it always becomes about teamwork. Nothing fundamentally wrong with competitive spirit, though. It can motivate, it can demotivate, and it needs to be managed. But you do have people who are narcissists and who are very self-driven, and they can be real problems in organizations, and we definitely find them in senior leadership roles, and they often need to be moved on. The other problem, though, is the Peter Principle, which is the early one mentioned, which is where you get promoted just above your level of competency. So you look great in your last job, and you look terrible in this one. That can also be changed. None of us ever stop growing. Really, the only thing that stops us growing is motivation. So provided we still have that motivation, we've all got an open neurome, a connectome it's called, and a mind that is plastic and can learn. It's really around the motivation and whether the organization has the right environment to just help them make that next leap. Most of our clients stepping into new roles don't have the ability to do it, and it's part of our job to help them get that as quickly as they can, and they all do pretty well when they're up on the ropes and the chips are down. So I would say the Peter Principle can be resolved provided the motivation is there.
Interesting, because another question from Michael, which leads nicely on from that. Do you think that leadership is inherent and can't be taught, but can be enhanced to fit the individual?
It's such a common thought that leadership is inherent. So I'm going to give you an enigmatic answer, which is leadership is inherent in all of us. And it will be brought out by circumstances, by different circumstances. It is utterly environmental. And so to those of you out there who believe that although it might be enhanced, it cannot really be taught, the flame cannot be lit, I just ask you to consider your own personal development and at what point you became conscious of yourself. There is a time before each of us became conscious when things were going on in our lives that had a deep impact on who we set out as. But that's not who we are when you were, let's say, 7 or 8. Isn't who you are when you're 18, and it isn't who you are when you're 29, and it isn't who you are when you're 50. I think in leadership is inherent in all of us in this context, which tends to bring it out, and it can definitely be enhanced.
I think you could do an entire lecture on self-awareness and how many of us are truly self-aware. But anyway, moving on to another question from Bob McDowell. How important is succession planning and management, recognizing when to move on and how to move on?
Oh, great question, Bob. And hello, Bob. How are you? It's so fundamentally important. At the moment, we're dealing with 3 family businesses who are going through succession who haven't planned for it. And one of them, they've come to us early enough because they know they need to, and there's huge tensions in the incoming family members and the retiring chief executive. Not that they don't get on, they get on really well as a family. It's just, it's very difficult. And even though in this case the chief executive is far-sighted enough to know that he needs to retire and he needs to make space, and we have this metaphor of creating space in the canopy so that younger trees can find the sun, so we get out of the way, basically. And he knows that in his heart and his soul, but nevertheless, it's incredibly difficult for him to do it, to actually step out of that sense of who he was, that identity that he's held for years. Very, very hard psychologically for him to find that next purpose in life and to create the space for the next generation to come in. But they will manage it. One of our other clients, total disaster in the second generation. The most horrific consequences of death and an unmanaged succession, what happened with the shares, what happened with the leadership roles, completely chaotic, and running into the same thing now. another generation on doing exactly the same thing. And so big job on to try and sort out the chemistry in the shareholders and the family and the internal leadership team. I'm determined that they won't make the same mistake thrice.
Yes, indeed. Conscious of time, and we're running up against the buffers. There is an opportunity, I think, Nick, for you to get all the questions and answer those we don't get to. But one from Tanji Morgan here. Given the new ways of working, how or does this impact your thesis?
You mean hybrid working? Hybrid working is here to stay. Our experience so far is that it's just environmental change. And so it's part of the business environment that great leaders just need to wrap their heads around. There's limited experience of it. We've got a year's experience of it. But again, to my point about deep experience and greater operation experience, there's plenty of organizations out there that have worked with remote teams for years. There's plenty of experience out there. And if you're not experienced in it and you're used to having everyone back in the office, you need to adjust your operational environment to get the best out of it and to mitigate for the worst. So it's just another factor. It's a new factor. It changes the environment. So it's a bit like saying, are we a services business just all in one big building in the City of London, or are we a mining business with teams all over the world on various rigs and down various holes and with dangerous kit? It's environmental, and so it's down to experience. It does change the environment, and so that does shift how you're going to lead a little, but it's perfectly possible to have all of the usual features of your business. You just need to adjust, and it's not that difficult, I don't think, to adjust. You need to think about it, and a bit of trial and error will get you there.
Yes, it's no big change. It's just a continuous evolution of how we do business. Quick point from Robert Wilthorpe Brown. The leader has to be aware of dangers of silos within the company, with teams motivated by their own profitability and ignoring the whole. So I think an interesting point there, Robert. And then final question from Eric Tracy. How do good leaders ensure they are receiving bad news as well as good? How to be good listeners that do not frighten off bad news? Yeah,
really two very interesting points. So the first point, I think, is inherent in my webinar today, which you will get that, you will get silos. It's almost impossible for human beings in group not to attach to each other. If you look at the list of biases in Wikipedia, you'll find there's just so many of them, it's almost impossible to remember them all. We're all biased, and we're all attached to our groups. It's part of being powerful and capable, and so therefore we all want to win for us and for our group against the other group. This is one of the great tensions, one of the great polarities, and it's ultimately not, if it's not solvable at a department head level, it will come to the board and get resolved there. And squaring that away is one of the great challenges of leadership, and great leaders do that very well. It's an obvious thing that's going to happen, and it's an obvious part of your job to sort that. And then cutting through to the truth. I don't think leaders are told the truth all the time. I don't think they can hope to be told the truth all of the time. It's inherent in the office that people treat you differently when you have the office. You can't not be who you are in the organization, and so therefore everyone speaks to you through that filter. You have to work super hard as a leader to find the truth, right? And you have to dig deep and know that you're not being told the truth. So I would say productive paranoia is the key quality in getting to the truth of things, and is very hard. So I would start with an absolutely skeptical mindset, knowing that no one's going to treat you as a normal human being, because you've got the chief job, so they won't.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for fascinating insight. As I said, all is available later when it's posted. So we must close. My thanks firstly to our sponsors, who you can see on the screen, for the support, and for whom we're truly grateful. Secondly, to the audience for your attention and questions. And I should note that the webinar series continues tomorrow with the US timed webinar on the use of AI to improve forecasting accuracy. Next week sees a fascinating trio of webinars, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Financial risk of nature loss, which, coming on the back of this morning's IPCC announcement, looks especially timely. The Corona crash, will we indeed build back better? And the SOFA Newspad, looking at employee share ownership. But before I say goodbye, our final thanks to you, Nick, for your presentation time this morning. It's been most entertaining, most enlightening, and I say it'll all be available later online. So from that, it's goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.